As I'm looking at the time, I think it's high time that we involve also you with your questions and your comments.
But I'm Baby from ICSE. I'm a little bit double advocating here. So totally agreeing personally to the community, but we are talking here about community participation is always beautiful. People are good to each other. And that's not truth, really. I mean, people are bad and good and between, and they have bad days and good days. So communities can get maligned towards each other. And what would be the mechanism to prevent that to happen? It's not always that Noxa, this kind of violence or disturbance come from outside. There are a lot of politics and arm trades and financial gains and everything coming in, but there's also communities attacking each other on purpose because they are communities which don't share certain aspects or ethnicity, religion, values, economic status, whatever it is. How do you get those ones together? I think I got one answer from Bernadette, which is transparent mechanism. Involve everyone, they have the same information, there's less this kind of somehow conspiracy theory that somebody else gets better than somebody else. But what else could be done that communities don't get maligned towards each other?
I was really struck by an academic from the University of Birmingham a couple of years ago saying to a bunch of donor advisors that equality and inclusion is a neoliberal norm. And she wasn't suggesting that we shouldn't have that norm. She wasn't suggesting we shouldn't believe in equality. But she was suggesting that when you go and work at village level, you need to recognise and be prepared to deal with the fact that equality may be not something that is valued at the community level. And inclusion may run absolutely against the very nature of power relations and structures and the way that certain communities work. And we found that really strongly in some work that we've done about Afghanistan, which has looked at different village contexts and how, with the National Solidarity Programme, the imposition of a particular kind of structure or committee for making decisions about how they would participate in the development of infrastructure and so on, worked in some places and didn't work in others, and that blanket view of how a village level committee should work needs to be overcome, and that you need very different specific setups in different villages, and we can map what kinds of villages they are and what the power structures are if you want to be able to program effectively. So for me, first, it's about recognizing that the values that we try and take into a community may not be shared and may be really unhelpful at certain points in time. And then second, thinking about whether we adjust the kinds of institutions that we support at village level in order to reflect local realities.
Thank you. Maybe you pass it directly to Andreas.
Well, as you correctly said, there are good and bad people all over the world, all over the places. But I think usually communities, they do have mechanisms to deal with that. I mean, that's also part of the community. You know, they have leaders, they have courts, local courts, whatever, but they have mechanisms to deal with that. And sometimes these mechanisms, they're there, but they're interrupted by, you know, external influence. It can be a negative, it can be a positive one, even through aid, it can be talking about do no harm. So I think we have, and it brings me back to what I said in the beginning, we have to know exactly how the community is functioning. Sometimes we don't have it and we don't have the time to do it, or we don't take the time to do it. I think that's one thing. I mean, this is also very much related to context analysis. And the second thing, I mean, a community, it's a bit broader than what it used to be maybe 50 years ago. I mean, government is everywhere, sometimes more, sometimes less. There is an influence, international communities everywhere as well. So I think we have to see the whole picture, you know, also the external factors which can influence the community. Exactly this question you're asking yourself is one of the questions we're asking ourselves also now in light of what's happening in South Sudan. You know, it's a frustrating, very frustrating, and I mean, it's a very painful exercise for the experiment for the people living there, but it's very frustrating for everybody who has been involved in one or the other matter with South Sudan. And now what's happening, you get 4,000 additional forces, peacekeeping or peace enforcing forces from UNMISS or from the region. So is that at the end, you know, what you have to have? Some kind of forces, armed forces to bring people to reason? I don't think so, but that's what's happening. That's the reality at the moment. So I think best is to do it, you know, if communities can try to regulate it themselves and to help them.
I have a question to Rachel. If I understood you correctly, the communities you surveyed said that it doesn't matter whether an NGO stays for longer, it doesn't get back a negative view on the government. I'm maybe a bit provocative saying, okay, is this a legitimacy for NGOs to keep staying, not wanting to hand over anymore and say, oh yeah, well, we don't do any harm to the government anyway, so let's continue. And on the other hand, governments leaning back saying, okay, we don't need to take the responsibility any longer. So for me, this is quite a striking finding, and I wonder what the implications are.
Okay, just to be clear, we never said to people, does it matter whether an NGO stays around for a long time? We asked specific questions about who's providing services and asked about who's providing services over time. And then we asked about people's perceptions of government actors at the local right up to the highest level. And so what we find is that there's no correlation between who is delivering and how people view the state. So the conclusion is that NGOs sticking around doesn't affect state legitimacy. It doesn't undermine people's views of the state. It potentially undermines the second element of state building, which is state capacity. So yes, it could mean that less efforts are made to invest in the capacity of the state to deliver services. But then I think that leads you into a question about whether we're assuming that it always should be the final objective for it to be the state that physically delivers the services itself. And I think that's probably where we get into a question of whether it doesn't have to be the state delivering the services. It can take responsibility for them. It can subcontract. It can work through non-state providers. And it can provide that stewardship role. It can put all the legislation in place around service delivery. It can regulate the process and still be accountable for it without actually delivering itself. So I think the question of whether we let states off from delivering services is a little bit more complicated, because it depends on what our view is of the specific activities as opposed to the specific responsibilities of the state are. Is that clear?
Today we talked very little. I think Bernadette mentioned it somehow in some few points, but we didn't really talk about our national partners, the ones who stay there. I mean, we might be there for long or for short time, but I think the important ones, the important actor for our work are the local partners or national partners. And I would like to ask, I don't know, maybe Julie or whoever wants to express on it, what are your opinion on working and with national partner and strengthening them, particularly when it comes to staying engaged when the situation turns to worse? I think it is very important. I would appreciate having some words on this issue.
I'm answering this more in terms of research capacity, because what I was saying earlier, when you've got the crowding out with lots of people coming from outside, what it means is that decisions are not made by people who are there long-term on the ground. And so as a research organization, one of our objectives is to build a capacity so that that knowledge can be developed and retained, and as things change, new knowledge developed on the ground. So that's been really important, and doing the actual research, but also getting people engaged with the policymakers. So, for example, in Sierra Leone, our team have been involved in development. They've been doing research on human resources, and they've been involved in developing the short-term and now the longer-term human resources plans. In Cambodia, they've done research on the contracting process and got further engaged with that. So I think the more we can help countries develop their own knowledge and therefore be able to base their own decisions on it, the more we give them power in the long term for making those important decisions about health services.
Is capacity building the answer on Verena's question?
Well, yes, but I mean, I'm going to answer it in terms of just how difficult it is to get donor money for that. And especially in complicated settings. You'll get money to deliver, for example, bed nets. And often it's hammered down to the last cent to be able to squeeze out the last, drop of efficiency from the bed net distribution program. And what you actually need is probably twice as much money so that you can employ double the numbers of people, so that you're employing a mentor coach as well as someone more junior, and they're doing it together and learning and true capacity building through skill transfer, through support of both the hard and the soft skills. But you also need the money to be able to make sure the right financial systems and reporting systems are in place, and they're not done by the externals, which is usually what happens, that they're genuinely done by the national and local staff are doing the reporting, they're doing the monitoring and evaluation. And then I thought Rachel's point on quality, which was another issue that came up in our working group on quality. Quality seems to matter a lot. I mean, in terms of if you, as you said, if you do something negative, it has a much, much greater impact than doing things positive. I mean, obviously we aim to do things positively. But if that's the case, then we also need money to be able to do the near-miss evaluations, to be able to really encourage that system where people report when things have not gone right. They may not have been a complete disaster, but, things haven't gone right, because that's an enormous learning opportunity. And if we're really trying to protect from really negative impact, then we need to invest in that as well. So that means an awful lot more money. But convincing donors that this is that you need, in fact, a lot more money to do what you're doing, because you're running these two things in parallel, the actual delivering of the bed nets, the saving the lives, but also doing capacity, and not just skills capacity. You're doing all this back-end management capacity and then developing these quality and safety, systems as well. But it's nearly impossible to get that type of money, and particularly in risky situations, because what happens is the donor wants to give you money for 3,000 bed nets to be delivered, and that's that at the most minimal amount of cost with the most minimal amount of risk possible. And yet what's actually needed is something much broader and potentially a little riskier as well. I mean, some of that money will go towards capacitating someone who then disappears. But that's part and parcel of working in these contexts.
Maybe I just would like to add on that one, capacity building. To what I have seen so far is that sometimes it is more capacity building that you can run the project than actually developing the system. And I think this step needs to be done as well. That again, it needs more capacity to run a system. Then when you are focusing on your own project itself, that's fine. But I think because I learned from the South Sudan context, we may have lost, I would say, approximately 6 years or even more to build up capacity to extend the services. With the limited resources you had, you could run what you had, but you have not been able to go outside of the district, and it needed to train nurses or doctors until they are there. So you are really having a long stretch to then fill in the gaps.
We discussed it in our group, but I would like to maybe ask a question to the panel. In French, I would say, je reste un peu sur ma faim. That means I'm not so very happy with what I got today, in the sense that I don't really see what is the basic difference between a general development approach we do with community participation, community development, etc., and system development, and what is the specifics in fragile states or fragile contexts. I heard certain things. You have to be more flexible, for instance. We had 2, 3 other specific things, but I would like to ask you, what is then really, because you talked a lot about things which are generic, I would say, for development cooperation. So where is really the difference between doing the work in not always simple situations? It's always a little bit kind of fragile, the government is not stable, your partners are changing, the community is difficult, etc., to address, etc. So that is not specific for fragile context. So what would you say, what is then really the difference in approach in what we are talking today?
Fragile context, I'm not sure this designation is very appropriate in the end of the day. At Global Fund level, we had a lot of discussion about development continuum. And we decided to stick to challenging operating environment. And I find it interesting because it says, well, there are challenges in the operation. What are the challenges? So you really have to analyze the context. When you say it's a fragile context, you take it as granted, okay, it's fragile, but you are less pushed to analyze how you can significantly work in such a context. So I would like to have your reaction about that, because fragile context covers many different things, a conflict and the different type of conflicts, or a natural catastrophe, or I don't know, all kinds of, there's so many differences. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacques. I think we came now at 4:30 to the crucial questions of today's. So we take this as really at the last round. No, it has to do with the glasses I put up this morning. You know, what are the differences? And but we have to look closely to them because there are some. So let's take it as the last round through the table, please.
Sorry, I'm going to use this as an advertising opportunity. But the first thing is to mention on Rebuild, which focuses on post-conflict states, although we deal with crisis as well. But if you're interested, there's a leaflet on the table. One thing that we've developed through the Rebuild process is a thematic working group for the health systems. And we call this, I put this on your chairs, so you'll wonder where it came from. We call this fragile and conflict-affected states, which captures most of them. But please do have a look at this and join. We have 500 members already on LinkedIn, and this group seems a very interested group in the kind of work we're doing. We struggle with this term, even the post-conflict, because we're all post-conflict. But some of the differences, and my background is more as a general development person working more in general development. And I think in some cases it's more extreme differences. Systems completely destroyed, information completely gone. There may also be trauma in relation to the conflict, which has an impact both on the communities and health workers. The other thing is, if you've got this very protracted problems of development, it's very difficult to do much about it. There is this notion that with the post-conflict comes a moment, sometimes called the window of opportunity, where it might be possible to do something. Whereas in the protracted case, that may not be possible. That window, as we found, may come quite late, but there may be possible for movement. And so that's a difference that we would see, looking for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Julie.
Yeah, so we too have struggled with the name. And in fact, within the Federation, we're calling it health in complex settings. There's a complexity to the setting, so it may not be a whole country, it may be a geographic area, and there's a high level of complexity. We played with fragility, the fragility is very much an element there. Challenging, we thought, well, perhaps that may be a little, may not be perceived in the right way by those who are considered to be challenging. So we came up, we couldn't do any better than complex settings, but it is complicated. That's for sure. Now, why is it different? Well, there's many different ways in which you could answer that question, but I think for me, one of the key things is the level of risk tolerance that's actually needed to work in these areas. So you need a very, very good risk framework, but you need to be tolerant of some risks. Obviously not personal security. There's those sorts of risks that need to be mitigated and managed. But there needs to be a level of tolerance for the fact that you'll be 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. That there are much easier places to work that will be much less costly. But we have to develop this level of tolerance of the risks of working there, and an understanding that in fact the cost-benefit ratio may in fact be better, more favourable in some of these areas than many other places. For example, if you take maternal mortality rate, if you're able to actually reach and work with the communities and reach the women, then potentially you can drive down maternal mortality from 800 to 600 with relatively small interventions, relatively simple interventions. That's not the full answer. But if you looked at it from a true cost-benefit rather than just cost point of view, then the cost-benefit ratio may be different. So it's around how we look at the risks, how we develop collectively as a community, the community themselves, the externals that may be supporting, the donors that are part of it, developing a better risk tolerance and idea of risk sharing of what it is and that cost-benefit ratio. So I don't know if that's fully answered the question. I think there are multiple other dimensions to it, to which I will leave my panel members to make comments, but that whole idea of risk tolerance, trying to avoid the aversion, because if you did the classic risk management framework, it would tell you not to go anywhere near these places, not to do this, that, and the other. If you just look at unit input cost-wise, then of course it's not going to be, the economists will scream. So it's about coming up with different ways and different dialogue and a need for a different risk tolerance and for very much putting cost and benefit together in that ratio, I would say.
Well, actually, I wanted to make also I wanted to highlight a bit the risk tolerance, but if you talk about flexibility, it sounds so easy. But if you look operational-wise, what it means, working with flexibility on the ground, and I've been doing that many years with scenarios, with adapting your programs and so on, that's not so easy. So, of course, we talk about flexibility and that's it, and then we can go and enjoy the heat outside. But, it's much behind this flexibility. One thing. The second thing is, in a lot of those fragile, or whatever you want to call it, I don't want to get into the semantic discussions now, especially not at this time. But I think also applying different instruments. I think that it has been always there, but it's much more systematic now that we are applying, humanitarian aid, peace building, negotiations, development, and so on, and we are applying on one context. So I think that's also something maybe Markus Heiniger would not be would contradict. But I think this is for me a relatively new, not completely new, but relatively new. And I think that's also something coming out of this, working in fragile environments. Working also with different partners at the same time. We talk about communities, but as I make a reference to this base there, but we have to work with the communities, we work with the government, we work with UN, all these different partners, including different partners. The spectrum is much wider also working there. And to tackle also more complex situation, of course, but also to work with more different partners. But yeah, a last thing, as you said, taking the risks, and it's not just financial, but it's also risk for people working on the ground. It's risk for everybody and to take these risks. And I think it's already it's a good statement if you can do it.
I have a lot of sympathy for some of the things that have been expressed. I sometimes wonder why we're comparing DRC with Afghanistan and the Solomon Islands and not with Zambia. You know, there's a lot of times where you either end up in the fragile club, and if you're not in it, you're not fragile, or you're something else. And it's something that I mentioned previously in the breakout session was that it seems to lead us into very binary thinking. And, I have a list of binaries that have come out of our work in South Sudan, that you're either conflict or post-conflict, you're either developmental or humanitarian, you're either working with the state or not with non-state providers. And the list goes on, and we just seem to go in these separate pathways depending whether we've articulated a country's fragile or not, that are really inappropriate, and we end up forgetting all about starting with context. So the continuum idea I find really, really helpful. But it starts to raise questions about the thresholds that trigger a change in the way that we work, that make it different where we're working. And I guess I had 3 things on my list of what's different, and one was the risk tolerance thing. What are we willing to bear, both in terms of success? The thing that I'd have a conversation about if the cameras weren't on and recording us was how much corruption are we willing to bear in particular circumstances? How much of the money we put in are we willing to be siphoned off? Because we know that that's going to happen in some places, but a lot of us work with donor agencies that are absolute zero tolerance on it. Does that mean we do nothing? And the other thing about what risks we're willing to bear are we are frequently working with the bad guys and not the good guys. That we're working with predatory governments, that we're working with warlords. And that means an entirely different way of operating as well. And are we ready to take the risks of that? The second one was value for money. And for me, it's similar to what you said about cost-benefit analysis, but reframing how we look at our programming. So it's much less about cost efficiency and much more about cost effectiveness, and putting a much bigger emphasis on that. And then finally, timelines. I'm so tired of hearing this thing about the post-conflict peace agreement golden year in which you can achieve so much. I actually think it takes longer in these contexts, not less time. And I know there's an opportunity for change to happen fast, but I think we're really unrealistic. And the last thing that I'd like to say is I think we're deceiving ourselves when we use the term fragility. And if I look at those glasses, the reality is that most of the countries that we work in that we call fragile, the glasses are smashed to bits already. And the idea that we're trying to stop them from getting smashed, to me, isn't actually the situation that we're honestly working in. Thanks.